It all began on a foggy evening when I wandered through the empty streets of a forgotten part of the city. I had been walking for hours, lost in thought, when I stumbled upon an antique shop tucked away between two dilapidated buildings. The wooden sign that hung above the entrance was barely visible through the layers of dust and grime. The shop's windows, though cracked, hinted at the promise of something peculiar within. It was the kind of place I usually avoided. Too much history, too much mystery. But something about this place drew me in, like a magnet pulling me toward its heart. As I stepped inside, the scent of old wood, dust, and forgotten memories enveloped me. The shelves were cluttered with oddities, faded paintings, tarnished silverware, porcelain dolls with cracked faces. But what caught my attention immediately was a mirror, small yet imposing, placed in the farthest corner of the room. Its frame was made of dark, weathered wood, intricately carved with strange symbols I couldn't recognize. It stood there, as though waiting for me to notice it. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with piercing eyes and an unsettling gaze, must have sensed my interest. Without speaking, he walked over to the mirror, his eyes never leaving mine. He didn't offer much explanation about it, only that it had been in his family for generations, passed down from one generation to the next. There was an air of caution in his voice, a silent warning hidden in the depths of his words, but I was intrigued. The mirror called to me in a way that was hard to describe, its surface reflecting a distorted version of reality, as if something unseen was lurking behind it. I left the shop with the mirror in my possession, unaware of what I was about to invite into my life. When I placed it in my bedroom, it seemed harmless at first, just another old object in the clutter of my apartment. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange unease settle over me. It was as though the mirror had taken on a life of its own, watching me from across the room. At first I dismissed it as paranoia, but the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each passing night. Something was wrong with the mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a reflection of my room. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt an oppressive presence behind me, something dark and malevolent. Every time I turned my back to it, I felt eyes on me, cold, unblinking eyes that burned into my skin. But when I dared glance over my shoulder, the reflection was always the same, still, empty, devoid of life. As the days passed, the unease turned into something deeper, something more sinister. The reflection in the mirror began to change, subtle at first. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of the glass, like a shadow shifting just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as though the mirror had become a portal, a gateway to something beyond my understanding. Then came the night when I saw him, the figure standing just behind me in the reflection. At first, it was barely noticeable, a silhouette shrouded in shadow. But over time, he grew clearer, his form more defined. A man, tall and thin, with a face twisted in agony, his eyes hollow and empty, staring directly at me. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that he wasn't a part of the reflection. He was something else, something that belonged to the mirror and nothing else. I didn't want to acknowledge him, didn't want to admit that I was being haunted by the figure in the glass. But there was no denying it any longer. The man's presence became more oppressive with each passing night, until I could no longer sleep without the constant sense of being watched. I tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. The reflection seemed to pull me in, as if it were calling out to me, beckoning me closer. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, like a murmur at the edge of my hearing, but they grew louder, more distinct. A voice deep and chilling slithered through the silence of my room. It wasn't in my head, it was real. The voice came from the mirror itself, each word sharp and clear. You can't escape the voice was not mine, nor was it the voice of the figure in the reflection. It was something darker, something that seemed to rise from the very depths of the mirror, a presence that reached out and wrapped around my mind, suffocating me with its coldness. That night I couldn't take it anymore. I had to destroy it, rid myself of the mirror that had become a prison, trapping me in its gaze. I grabbed it, the frame cold under my hands, and dragged it to the kitchen, intending to smash it with a hammer. But when I touched the glass, a jolt of ice shot up my spine. It felt as though the mirror had a will of its own, refusing to be destroyed. The reflection shimmered, as if it were alive, twisting and warping into something else entirely. I could feel the weight of the figure behind me, pressing into my back, and the whispers in my ears grew louder. I dropped the mirror, too afraid to touch it again, but too terrified to leave the room. The whispers never stopped. The figure in the glass never stopped watching. I couldn't escape it. No matter what I did, no matter where I went, the presence followed me. It was as if the mirror had become a part of me, a part of my soul, its curse lingering in every corner of my life. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. Objects moved when I wasn't looking, doors opened by themselves, and the whispers grew more insistent. It was as if the mirror had reached out into my reality, pulling the dark presence into my world. I researched the mirror, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening, and what I found sent chills down my spine. The mirror wasn't just a cursed object, it was a portal, a doorway into another realm. The figure in the glass was trapped within it, bound by a dark pact made long ago. But now that I had invited it into my life, there was no escape. The curse had been passed on to me. That night, I tried to destroy the mirror once and for all. But as my hands touched the frame, a wave of cold swept over me, and I could feel the presence, the figure in the reflection, growing stronger. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was alive, feeding off my fear, growing more powerful with each passing moment. I don't know what happened after that. The whispers are still with me, echoing in the back of my mind. The figure is always there, watching, waiting. I can't escape it, no matter how far I run. The mirror has become a part of me, and I fear it always will be. The curse is mine now, a dark reflection that I can never outrun. And as I sit here writing this, I know that the mirror is still watching me. It never stops. It never will. I was never one to believe in superstition, dismissing the whispers of old wives' tales and cautionary legends as nothing more than entertaining stories. But my encounter with the cursed doll would change everything I thought I knew. It happened one fateful afternoon at a small, cluttered antique store nestled in the back streets of the city. I had wandered in on a whim, having a few hours to kill before an evening appointment. The shop was dim, with the musty scent of aged wood and dust hanging in the air. I meandered through aisles of forgotten trinkets, objects that spoke of bygone eras and untold histories. And then I saw it, the doll. It was small, about the size of a child's toy, its porcelain face chipped at the edges, but the eyes were what struck me most. They were wide, dark pools that seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. No matter where I stood, those eyes remained locked on mine, an unnerving sensation that grew stronger the longer I looked at it. I couldn't explain why, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to reach out and pick it up. The rest of the store faded into the background as I found myself stepping closer, my hand drawn to the shelf where it sat. It felt strange to touch it, as if the doll itself had been waiting for me, anticipating the moment when I would bring it into my home. I couldn't resist. I picked it up. That evening I placed the doll on a shelf in my living room, near the window. As I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The room felt colder, and despite the warmth of the evening, an eerie chill crept over me. The doll, now sitting motionless, seemed to loom over the space, its unblinking eyes fixed on me. It didn't seem to make sense, but something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off, reminding myself that I was being irrational. I turned on the television, attempting to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the growing unease. The next morning I awoke to a strange sense of discomfort. The doll was no longer facing forward, its body twisted at an odd angle, its head turned sharply to the side. I blinked, unsure whether it had always been like that or if I had somehow moved it in my sleep. It didn't matter. The strange sensation continued to linger, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't ignore. Then the whispers began. At first they were faint, so quiet that I dismissed them as nothing more than the house settling, the wind moving through the cracks of the window. But the whispers persisted. They grew louder. At night, when the house was still, I could hear them clearly, creeping through the silence like a soft murmur, something barely audible, yet impossible to ignore. It was impossible to tell exactly what they said, but the voices sounded close, as though they were coming from just behind me, or even inside my own mind. At times I thought I could hear a word or two, something resembling a command urging me to move, to act, to come closer. But when I tried to listen harder, it vanished. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the days went on, it became impossible to ignore the sense of dread that clung to me, suffocating my every thought. The whispers grew more distinct, and the movements of the doll became impossible to explain. One night I went to bed, exhausted from the relentless unease that followed me everywhere. When I woke up, the doll was sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me with its glassy eyes, its mouth slightly open. I had never moved it, had never placed it there. The air around me seemed thick, as if the doll's very presence was pressing against my chest, stifling me. The next day I went back to the antique shop, desperate for answers. The elderly shopkeeper, with her long gray hair and knowing eyes, listened intently as I recounted the strange events. She didn't say much at first, but when I mentioned the doll, her face tightened. She said there's something about the doll, and that it has a history. She explained that the doll had once been part of a family's heirloom collection. It was meant to be a symbol of love, of protection, but things went terribly wrong. The child who had owned the doll had tragically died, and the family, unable to cope with the loss, refused to part with it. The doll became a constant presence in their home, and strange things began happening. Objects moved. Unexplained noises echoed through the house. The family's once peaceful home was haunted by an oppressive presence. The shopkeeper went on, telling me that the curse attached to the doll had lingered for years, passed down to whoever took possession of it. There had been others, she claimed, who had taken the doll, only to find themselves tormented by the same haunting whispers and movements. Some went mad. Others simply disappeared. I listened in disbelief. It seemed like something out of a horror novel. But deep down I felt the truth of her words, the weight of her warning settling over me. I had made a terrible mistake, but I was too late. I couldn't go back. The doll had already marked me. The whispers grew louder. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. Everywhere I went, the doll's gaze followed me. I tried to keep it in a closet, to hide it away, but it always found its way back, sitting in the middle of the room, staring at me. It was as if it were waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it, to do something. One night, unable to stand the torment any longer, I took the doll to the river. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, echoing in my mind, demanding my attention, urging me to do something. I didn't know what would happen if I simply let it be, but I had to try. Standing at the edge of the river, I looked down at the doll one last time. The water churned beneath me, dark and ominous. With shaking hands, I tossed the doll into the water, watching as it sank below the surface, its eyes still fixed on me, even as it disappeared from view. For a moment I thought it was over. The weight lifted. The whispers stopped. The tension in the air evaporated. But when I awoke the next morning, the doll was back, sitting on the shelf, its eyes staring at me. The whispers had never ceased. The curse had never ceased. There was no escaping it, no running from it. The doll was mine now, and I was its. I had always been fascinated by antiques, particularly the kind with a history, something that had been passed down through generations. It was this fascination that led me to the mirror at the estate sale. It was old, perhaps centuries old, with an intricate golden frame adorned with patterns that resembled vines and birds. There was a certain charm to it, something that spoke of an era long gone, of memories and lives lived in this very house. The moment I laid eyes on it, I felt an odd pull, something magnetic that urged me to claim it, to take it home. The seller, an elderly woman with sharp, gray eyes, told me that it had been in her family for generations. She mentioned that it had always been a part of the house, standing in the hallway, watching over everyone who lived there. But there was something about the way she said it that made me uneasy. She hesitated before telling me that it was a good deal, almost as if she wanted to keep it but knew it had to be sold. Despite her warning, I couldn't resist. The price was right, and I convinced myself that I was simply indulging in my passion for antique finds. The mirror would look perfect above my mantel, I thought, a statement piece in my living room. When I brought it home, I could sense a change in the air. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that something wasn't quite right. The mirror's reflection seemed sharper than anything else in the room, as though it wasn't just reflecting the space but absorbing it, making the room feel colder, emptier. The house itself felt quieter, more still. I tried to dismiss the feeling. After all, it was just a mirror. Yet every time I glanced at it, I felt something, a presence, a watching eye. It wasn't the image of me that I saw, but something else, something far older and darker. In the beginning, it was just fleeting glimpses. When I'd walk past the mirror, I would catch a reflection of a shadow, something moving just out of sight. It would vanish the moment I turned to face it, but the unease remained. The longer I left the mirror in the room, the stronger the sensations became. The shadows in the reflection grew more distinct, taking on the shape of figures, people who seemed to watch me, who stood just outside my reach. At night, the reflection would shift, growing darker, and I would hear soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself, though no one else was around. The sound was impossible to ignore. It began as a soft murmur, as though someone was speaking just behind me, their voice low and urgent. But when I turned, the room was always empty. Each time I looked at the mirror, the whispers would grow louder, and the shadows would seem closer, reaching toward me. Soon it wasn't just the reflections that bothered me. It was the coldness that began to seep into the room. The temperature would drop so low, I could see my breath, even on the warmest days. No matter how much I adjusted the thermostat, the chill remained. I found myself huddled under blankets in my own home, shivering uncontrollably, as though winter had set in early. Then the visions began. I had been sitting in my living room one evening, reading a book, when I felt the pull once more. I glanced at the mirror, and for a moment I saw not just the room behind me, but something else, something out of place. The reflection in the glass shifted again, and I saw a figure, a woman in old-fashioned clothing, standing behind me. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. Her lips moved, though no sound came from her mouth. At that moment, my heart pounded in my chest. I turned to face the woman, but she was gone. The reflection returned to normal, showing nothing but the empty room and my own bewildered face. But I knew something had changed. I could feel it. The presence was no longer just in the reflection, it was in the room with me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something from the other side. The whispers grew stronger, filling the silence of the house, becoming clearer each night. The The shadows in the mirror no longer hid in the background, they stepped forward, becoming solid shapes. A man appeared one night, standing in the corner of the reflection, his face obscured in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my soul. It wasn't long before I began to lose sleep, waking in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, heart racing. I couldn't stay in the living room anymore. Every time I tried to go near the mirror, the voices would surge, louder and more insistent, the shadows moving closer, as though something wanted to step out of the glass and into the room with me. I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, I decided to cover the mirror with a blanket, hoping to block out whatever was coming from it. But as soon as I placed the cloth over the glass, the temperature dropped even further, and the whispers turned into a scream, a terrifying, screeching sound that echoed through the walls, reverberating in my bones. I removed the blanket in a panic, but the reflection was no longer my living room. Instead, the glass showed something else, something horrible. The figures were there, standing in the room, their faces twisted in pain and rage, their hands reaching out from the mirror, trying to pull themselves into my world. I staggered back, horrified, and in that moment I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. The mirror wasn't just an object, it was a portal, a window to something far darker than I could understand. And it was now connected to me. I knew I had to get rid of it, but it wasn't that simple. The mirror seemed to have its grip on me, and every time I tried to move it or cover it up, the house would grow colder, the whispers louder. I could no longer go near it without feeling the pressure building in my chest, the sense of something watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I tried everything to get rid of it, calling experts, asking friends, but no one could explain what was happening. The mirror remained, and so did the curse that came with it. As days turned into weeks, I realized that I wasn't just being haunted by a cursed object, I had become part of the mirror's history. I could feel myself slipping away, fading into the same dark reflection I had first seen. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a prison, one that I could never escape. When I first moved into the old house, I didn't think much of the attic. It was one of those spaces that seemed to belong to the past, filled with dusty old boxes, forgotten furniture, and remnants of lives that had come before. The house itself was beautiful, but there was something about it that gave me an uneasy feeling, a feeling I couldn't quite place. It was a large Victorian-style house, with creaky floors and tall windows that let in just enough light to make everything feel too quiet, too still. The attic, with its low ceiling and narrow stairs, felt like an afterthought, an empty space no one wanted to bother with. The previous owners had left most of their belongings behind, and while most of it was just old clothing, books, and knickknacks, one item caught my eye. It was a doll. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. It was an antique, a porcelain figure with delicate features, dressed in a faded blue gown. But as I looked closer, something about it unsettled me. Its eyes, large and glassy, seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. The expression on its face was calm, almost serene, but there was an unnaturalness to it, like the kind of calm that precedes a storm. I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a doll, a relic of a time long past. But every time I went up to the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Its unblinking eyes seemed to pierce into me, and the longer I stayed in the attic, the more I felt the temperature drop around me. It was as though the room itself was alive, breathing with a presence that I couldn't understand. It wasn't long before strange things began happening. At night, I would hear faint footsteps above me in the attic, but when I checked, the space was always empty. Other times, I would find the doll moved, just slightly, its head turned a little, or its hands shifted. I chalked it up to my imagination at first, but the unease grew, and I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the house. The whispers came next. At first, they were so faint that I thought it was just the wind. but soon they became louder, more distinct. Soft murmurs filled the rooms, especially near the attic stairs, as though something or someone was trying to communicate. I told myself it was the house settling, the sound of old wood groaning, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The doll, once a passive observer, now felt like it was actively involved in whatever was happening. It was as though it had come to life, its eyes following my every move, its head tilting slightly whenever I passed by. The whispers seemed to originate from the direction of the attic, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn back there, as if the doll was calling me, beckoning me to come closer. One evening I couldn't take it anymore. I went up to the attic to confront whatever was happening, to put my mind at ease. The moment I stepped into the space, the temperature dropped and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The doll sat in the corner, just where I had left it, but something was different. Its eyes, those unsettling, glassy eyes, were now focused directly on me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I approached the doll. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch it, and the instant I made contact, a wave of cold rushed through me. My vision blurred, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as though something was pressing down on me. The whispers became clearer, no longer just murmurs, but voices, many voices, all speaking at once, too fast for me to understand. But one word echoed through the chaos, a single word that sent a shock of terror through me. Leave. I recoiled, stumbling back from the doll, my breath shallow, my heart racing. The whispers stopped, but the air in the attic felt thick with something malevolent, something that had been waiting for me. The doll seemed to stare at me, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, as if it were alive, as if it were alive, as if it had been waiting for me to make that one fatal mistake, to touch it. I ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me, my mind spinning with the realization that the doll was not just an object. It was a conduit, a vessel for something ancient and dark, and it had been waiting for me to discover its power, to open the door to whatever evil it harbored. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers returned, and the doll seemed to be everywhere, its presence always looming, just at the edge of my vision. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I moved it, no matter where I hid it, it always found its way back to the attic, always staring, always waiting. I had to get rid of it, but I knew deep down that it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just a doll, it was a curse, something far older and far more dangerous than I had realized. It had been waiting for me to find it, to awaken it, and now it had me in its grip. I tried to burn it, to bury it, but no matter what I did, it always returned. The doll was a part of the house, a part of something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just an object, it was a presence, and as long as I remained in the house, I would never be free of it. I had no choice but to leave, but I knew that the doll's curse would follow me. It had already marked me, and no matter where I went, it would find me again. The whispers would follow me, always just behind me, always calling my name, and the doll, with its cold, lifeless eyes, would never stop watching.